You are trapped on a wooden ship for months with 50 other unwashed criminals, surrounded by nothing but endless ocean. The nearest land is weeks away. Your stomach is gnawing at itself from hunger. You open the food barrel and find maggots crawling through what used to be your dinner. This was the terrifying reality that every pirate faced, and if they got food preservation wrong, it meant certain death. But here is what will shock you. Pirates did not just survive these impossible conditions. They thrived. They developed food preservation techniques so advanced that modern survival experts still study their methods today. And some of these techniques were so disgusting, so horrifying, that you might lose your appetite just hearing about them. Today, I am going to reveal the secret survival methods that kept the most notorious pirates in history alive during their deadliest voyages. Trust me, by the end of this video, you will never look at your refrigerator the same way again. Let me start with something that will make your skin crawl. The number one killer on pirate ships was not sword fights or cannon battles. It was starvation. Ships could carry enough weapons to sink an entire fleet, but keeping food fresh for months at sea. That was the real challenge that separated successful pirate crews from the ones whose bones ended up scattered across the ocean floor. The average pirate voyage lasted anywhere from 3 to 8 months. Now think about this for a second. When was the last time you went 3 days without fresh food? These men had to survive for months with no refrigeration, no preservatives, and no way to restock their supplies except by raiding other ships or finding remote islands. But here is where it gets absolutely fascinating. Pirates were not just random criminals who got lucky. They were survival experts who had to master the science of food preservation or face a slow, agonizing death from malnutrition. And the methods they developed were nothing short of ingenious. The first technique that saved countless pirate lives was something called salting. But this was not your grandmother sprinkling salt on her roast chicken. This was industrial-level salt preservation that could keep meat edible for over a year. Pirates would pack barrels with alternating layers of salt and meat, creating what they called salt pork or salt beef. Here is the part that most people do not know. Pirates needed so much salt for preservation that they would attack merchant ships just to steal their salt supplies. Salt was literally more valuable than gold on some voyages because without it, the entire crew would starve to death. But wait, it gets even more extreme. Some pirate crews would raid coastal salt mines, not for treasure, but for the salt they needed to preserve their food. Imagine being so desperate for survival that you risk your life attacking a fortified salt mine just to keep your bacon from rotting. The salting process itself was brutal work that took days to complete. Pirates would slaughter entire herds of cattle or pigs when they raided coastal towns, then spend the next week frantically salting every piece of meat they could fit in their barrels. One mistake in the salt-to-meat ratio, and weeks later they would open those barrels to find a putrid, maggot-infested mess that could kill them faster than enemy cannons. Speaking of maggots, here is something that will make you question everything you think you know about food safety. Pirates actually learned to embrace maggots as part of their survival strategy. I know that sounds absolutely disgusting, but let me explain why this was actually brilliant. When meat started to go bad despite their best preservation efforts, pirates discovered that certain types of maggots were actually safe to eat and provided crucial protein. They called this nightmare fuel ship biscuit surprise, and experienced pirates could tell the difference between harmful maggots and edible ones just by looking at them. But the real genius was not eating the maggots. It was using them as an early warning system. Pirates would deliberately let small portions of meat develop maggots, then monitor those maggots closely. If the maggots started dying, it meant the meat was becoming too toxic even for them to survive, which warned the pirates to throw that batch overboard before it poisoned the entire crew. Think about how desperate your situation has to be before eating maggots becomes a survival strategy. But this is exactly the kind of life-or-death innovation that separated successful pirate crews from the ones that never made it home. Now let me tell you about a preservation method that was so effective, it is still used today. Smoking meat was not just about flavor for pirates. It was about survival. But pirate smoking techniques were far more sophisticated than anything you have seen at a modern barbecue restaurant. Pirates built elaborate smoking chambers in the lower decks of their ships. These were not simple fire pits. They were engineered ventilation systems that could maintain precise temperatures for days at a time. The key was creating enough smoke to preserve the meat while not burning down the wooden ship they were living on. Here is the detail that blew my mind when I first learned about it. Pirates discovered that different types of wood created different preservation effects. They preferred hardwoods like oak and hickory not just for flavor, but because these woods produced chemicals that actively prevented bacterial growth. They were basically creating natural antibiotics through their smoking process. The smoking process could take up to 2 weeks for larger cuts of meat. During this time, pirates had to maintain constant fires while being incredibly careful not to create too much heat that would cook the meat instead of preserving it. One crew member was always assigned as the smoking master, and this job was considered so critical that smoking masters were paid extra shares of treasure. But here is where pirate innovation gets really wild. Some crews learned to combine smoking with sailing, using the constant motion of the ship to circulate smoke more evenly around their meat. They turned their entire ship into a giant smoking machine that preserved food while they sailed toward their next target. However, smoking had one major drawback that nearly cost some pirate crews their lives. The constant smoke made it almost impossible to maintain the element of surprise when approaching enemy ships. Merchant vessels could spot the telltale smoke from pirate smoking operations from miles away, giving them time to escape or prepare for battle. This leads us to one of the most clever food preservation innovations in pirate history, hardtack. Now you might think hardtack is just dry, tasteless crackers, but pirate hardtack was a technological marvel that could last for decades if stored properly. The secret was in the preparation. Pirates made hardtack using only flour, water, and salt, but the baking process was crucial. The biscuits had to be baked multiple times at precise temperatures to remove every trace of moisture without burning them. Too much moisture and they would mold within weeks. Too little moisture and they would crumble into inedible dust. Here is what makes this absolutely incredible. Archaeologists have found pirate hardtack in shipwrecks that is over 300 years old and still technically edible. That is better preservation than most modern processed foods achieve. But eating hardtack was its own survival challenge. These biscuits were so hard they could break teeth if you tried to bite them directly. Pirates learned to soak them in water, rum, or whatever liquid they had available to soften them enough to chew. Some crews would grind hardtack into powder and mix it with fat to create a paste that provided concentrated calories. The really smart pirates learned to make hardtack soup by combining softened hardtack with any vegetables, meat, or even seaweed they could find. This became the foundation of what we now know as ship stew, a meal that could keep a crew fed and healthy for months. Now let me reveal something that sounds like science fiction but was actually common practice among the most successful pirate crews. They learned to preserve fresh vegetables using fermentation techniques that were centuries ahead of their time. Sauerkraut was not invented by Germans. It was perfected by pirates who discovered that fermented cabbage could prevent scurvy while lasting for months in storage barrels. But pirate sauerkraut was much more than just preserved cabbage. They learned to ferment entire vegetable medleys that provided complete nutrition. The fermentation process itself was like controlled spoilage. Pirates would pack vegetables in salt brine and let specific types of bacteria break down the plant matter in ways that preserved nutrients while preventing harmful bacteria from taking over. This required precise understanding of bacterial cultures that would not be officially discovered by scientists for another 200 years. Here is the part that shows how advanced pirate food science really was. Different pirate crews developed signature fermentation recipes that they guarded as trade secrets. Some used specific combinations of sea salt and herbs that created unique bacterial environments. Others discovered that adding small amounts of rum to their fermentation barrels would speed up the process while adding preservative qualities. The most successful captains treated their fermentation masters like treasure. These crew members understood the delicate balance between beneficial fermentation and deadly spoilage. One mistake could turn a barrel of life-saving vegetables into a toxic brew that could kill half the crew. But fermentation came with its own risks. If the process went wrong, fermented vegetables could produce alcohol levels high enough to intoxicate the entire crew. There are historical accounts of pirate ships wandering aimlessly for days because the crew got accidentally drunk off their own preserved vegetables. This brings us to one of the most disgusting yet effective preservation methods in pirate history: rendering fat. This technique was so revolting that even hardened pirates had trouble stomaching it, but it could mean the difference between life and death during long voyages. Pirates learned that animal fat could preserve meat almost indefinitely if the rendering process was done correctly. They would slowly cook down fat from cattle, pigs, or even whales until it became pure liquid lard. Then they would submerge pieces of cooked meat completely in this fat, creating an airtight seal that prevented spoilage. The key was maintaining the fat barrier. Any crack or gap that allowed air to reach the meat would cause rapid spoilage that could contaminate entire barrels. Pirates became experts at sealing these fat-preserved foods so completely that they could last for over a year. But here is where it gets really gross. Pirates would often reuse the same fat for multiple preservation cycles. They would melt down old fat, strain out any spoiled bits, and use it again for new batches of meat. This recycling process meant that some preservation fat was used continuously for years, picking up flavors and who knows what else along the way. The fat preservation method was so effective that some pirate crews could go 8 months without restocking their meat supplies. But eating fat-preserved meat was its own challenge. The meat had to be carefully cleaned of all fat before cooking, or it would be so rich that it would make crew members violently sick. Now let me tell you about a preservation innovation that was so dangerous, pirates literally risked their lives every time they used it. Pickling with vinegar. This sounds harmless, but pirate-strength pickling solutions were acidic enough to dissolve metal and could cause severe chemical burns. Pirates discovered that high-acid environments could preserve foods for months, but creating these solutions required handling extremely concentrated vinegars that were toxic to human skin. Crew members assigned to pickling duty had to wear leather gloves and face coverings to avoid being burned by acid splashes. The pickling process itself was like a controlled chemical reaction. Pirates would layer vegetables with salt, then cover them with vinegar solutions so strong they could strip paint. The acid would break down cell walls while creating an environment where harmful bacteria could not survive. But here is what made pirate pickling truly innovative. They learned to combine different acids to create preservation solutions that were more effective than pure vinegar. Some crews added citrus juice from raided merchant ships. Others discovered that fermenting fruit into high-acid wine created excellent pickling solutions. The really advanced pirate crews learned to adjust their pickling acid levels based on what they were preserving. Delicate vegetables needed weaker solutions that preserved texture. Tougher foods could handle stronger acids that provided longer preservation times. However, pickling accidents were common and often fatal. If crew members ingested too much of the pickling solution, it could cause internal chemical burns that led to slow, agonizing death. Pirates had to balance the life-saving preservation benefits against the very real risk of acid poisoning. This leads us to perhaps the most ingenious food preservation system ever developed by pirates: cache islands. These were secret food storage locations that allowed pirate crews to create supply chains across entire ocean regions. Cache islands were carefully selected remote locations where pirates would bury or hide preserved food supplies for future use. But this was not just digging holes and hoping for the best. Pirates developed sophisticated storage systems that could protect food from weather, animals, and rival pirate crews for years. The construction of a cache island storage system was a major operation that could take weeks to complete. Pirates would build underground storage chambers using waterproof materials like tar and canvas. They would create drainage systems to prevent flooding and ventilation systems to prevent condensation that could spoil stored food. Here is the part that shows how strategically advanced these pirates really were. Different crews would maintain networks of cache islands across hundreds of miles of ocean territory. They could plan voyages that lasted for years by strategically positioned food resupply points that only they knew about. The most successful pirate captains treated cache island locations as more valuable than treasure maps. These storage locations represented the difference between successful long-term piracy and slow death by starvation. Some captains would kill crew members who threatened to reveal cache island locations to enemies. But cache islands came with their own massive risks. If rival pirates discovered your storage locations, they could either steal your supplies or poison them to eliminate competition. Pirates had to constantly monitor their cache islands and develop elaborate security measures to protect their food supplies. The cache island system also required incredible navigation skills. Pirates had to be able to find tiny, unmarked islands in vast oceans without modern GPS or detailed maps. They developed navigation techniques using star positions, ocean currents, and even bird flight patterns to relocate their hidden food supplies. Now here is something that will completely change how you think about pirate intelligence. The most successful pirate crews did not just preserve food randomly. They developed systematic meal planning that would make modern nutritionists proud. Pirates understood that different preserved foods provided different nutrients, and they learned to combine these foods in ways that prevented malnutrition and scurvy. They knew that salt pork provided protein, sauerkraut provided vitamins, and hardtack provided carbohydrates. But the real genius was in understanding how these foods worked together. Experienced pirate cooks learned to create meal rotations that ensured crew members got balanced nutrition throughout their voyages. They understood that relying on just one type of preserved food, even if it was effective, would eventually lead to nutritional deficiencies. So they diversified their food stores and created meal plans that rotated through different types of preserved meats, vegetables, and grains. This level of nutritional planning was almost unheard of in the 17th and 18th centuries. Most sailors, even on naval ships, suffered from scurvy and other diseases caused by poor diet. But successful pirate crews, through their ingenious food preservation and meal planning, often remained healthier than their legitimate counterparts. And finally, let me tell you about the ultimate pirate food preservation secret: the art of the raid. While all these other methods were crucial, the most effective way for pirates to get fresh food was to simply take it from someone else. Pirate raids were not just about treasure. They were often about resupplying their ships with fresh provisions. When they attacked a merchant vessel, the first thing they would do after securing the ship was to check the cargo holds for food, water, and livestock. Fresh meat, fruits, and vegetables were often more valuable than gold to a hungry pirate crew. But here is the strategic genius behind the raid as a food preservation method. Pirates would often target ships specifically known to be carrying provisions. They would gather intelligence on trade routes and merchant schedules, then ambush ships that were likely to be carrying fresh food supplies. This meant that successful pirate crews were not just skilled fighters. They were also master strategists and intelligence gatherers. They understood that controlling the flow of food was just as important as controlling the flow of gold. So, the next time you open your refrigerator, remember the pirates. Remember their ingenuity, their desperation, and their horrifyingly effective methods for keeping food fresh in the most impossible conditions. Because when it came to survival, pirates were not just criminals. They were the ultimate food preservation experts. And their legacy lives on, not just in buried treasure, but in every can of pickled vegetables and every piece of jerky you eat today.